The sky above the federal base that day was cloudless, just an endless stretch of blue, cold, and unnervingly still. The wind drifted across the barbed wire fence, past towering antenna masts, then paused at Training Ground 4, where one creature stood completely motionless. No whining, no barking, not even a blink. Valor, a German shepherd with a powerful build, low frame, wide shoulders, sun-scorched coat. But it wasn't Valor's muscles or stance that caught attention. It was the eyes. Eyes that couldn't be trained. Eyes that held something almost human. Not rage, not aggression, just awareness. So sharp, so precise, that everyone around the field fell silent. As if they weren't watching the dog was watching them. Elias Quinn stepped out from the command room, his silver-gray uniform pressed crisp without a single crease. The man wasn't large, didn't speak much, rarely smiled, but the way he pulled on his gloves, tied his boots, then made a simple gesture with one finger to Valor said everything. No whistles, no verbal command. Valor moved like a shadow, a streak of gray cutting through the field. He bolted from point A to point B, hurdled 3 obstacles, paused just once to avoid the clack of a simulated mine trigger, then shifted course without hesitation. As he scaled a wooden wall, his hind legs barely touched the surface, just a light push, and his whole body soared like a living arrow. The second he landed, Valor dropped into a crouch, ears forward, eyes locked, awaiting the next signal from Elias. There was no signal, just a glance, a tiny tilt of the head from Elias, and Valor understood. He pivoted, retraced his steps, bypassed 3 hostage stand-ins without touching a single one, then halted in front of a black duffel suspected to be an IED. He sniffed twice, then let out a single bark, short, sharp, and surgical, like a blade cracking down on steel. A lieutenant watching from the sideline furrowed his brow, said nothing. But everyone's eyes turned to Elias, then quickly looked away. Like they were used to this, and maybe a little afraid of it. At the Federal K-9 Center, the highest tier of national canine training, no one didn't know Valor and Elias. A silent duo. Unbreakable. A man who didn't care for politics. A dog who didn't need adjusting. They weren't in the media. They weren't in the annual commendation reels. But anytime a situation was flagged, urgent K-9 required, their names were the first ones tagged in the internal logs. And there was one more thing, something only Elias and Valor knew. The 12th signal. The center taught 11. Attack, guard, lead, detect, each tied to a hand sign. But the 12th? That was theirs. A soft touch to the collar, followed by a retreat of the hand. Not written in manuals, not taught to anyone else. That signal meant, if I go down, you finish the mission. Alone. And that day, after a routine drill, as Elias turned to walk back inside, he quietly touched the collar of his uniform. Just a fraction of a second. But Valor saw. Inside storage room 3 of the Federal Center, flickering fluorescent lights reflected off stacks of sealed files printed in silver ink. Elias removed his gloves, placed them on the cold steel table, and opened a red sealed folder marked, "No electronic record allowed." It wasn't a file that bore his name, but his fingerprints were everywhere inside. First page. 5 disappearances in 8 months. All were whistleblowers, all scheduled to meet with Agent Elias Quinn. All vanished before the meetings happened. Elias sat down, slowly flipped through the pages, like retracing memories that weren't supposed to be his. Some notes were blacked out. Some photos had corners sliced off. Some names were reshuffled, but somehow he still recognized them. Every curve of handwriting, every familiar face. The tiny details only someone from the inside would know were fake. His finger stopped on one report. The last line read, Recommend this case be reclassified under behavioral risk. No further investigation. Underneath, a signature Elias would never forget. Sawyer Vance. Sawyer. A man Elias once called his brother. They had shared over 10 missions, survived an ambush at the southern border, pulled a kidnapped child out of a running incinerator together. The change didn't happen overnight. It was slow, subtle. First came the double-edged remarks, then the private calls Sawyer never explained. And finally, a summons, a meeting with a special review group. When Elias declined, the reason noted was lack of cooperation. That meeting, held in a darkened conference room where a strip of yellow light barely touched the table and the camera was taped over with black cloth, ended with an offer. You've got skills, connections. If you're open to transferring to behavioral analysis, we can make it happen. All we ask is that you stop digging into things that aren't your responsibility. Elias didn't respond. He just stared at the teacup in front of him, the water long cold, and remembered the firm handshake of a female witness he once protected. She had told him, "I still believe not everyone in the force is the same." The next day she vanished. The note in her file read, "Relocated. No notice given." Elias closed the classified folder, tucked it into his coat, and walked out of the storage room. No one looked up, but he knew he had crossed a line there was no coming back from. When he returned to his temporary quarters, Elias didn't turn on the light. He sat down beside Valor, the dog already lying low near the door, ears perked, never once disengaging from watch mode. Elias lowered his hand onto Valor's head. No stroke, no comfort, just a firm placement. Like someone sealing a decision with no return. Valor didn't flinch. He just inhaled deeply. Then exhaled. Outside, the shift change lights on the tower started blinking. A faint metallic scent drifted in through the cracks of the door. Inside that silent room, a man and his dog, without exchanging a word, both understood. The battle ahead wouldn't come with backup. No cover from command. No favors for those who refused to stay quiet. There was only one thing left worth protecting. The truth. And if it came to that, they would protect it alone, at any cost. The raid happened on a sunny morning. Special ops, rapid response, and a few federal agents were mobilized urgently. An anonymous tip had flagged a suspected logistics hub for illegal human trafficking, somewhere on the outskirts south of Houston. Elias was assigned to the operation, not as a lead, but as an additional unit. A strange designation, but he didn't push back. He brought valor, didn't question it, didn't resist. But in his inner pocket, he carried a copy of a confidential internal investigation report. The convoy stopped near an abandoned complex. Sunlight cut across cracked concrete and boarded-up windows. The air was thick, moldy, tinged with the burnt scent of scorched wiring. Elias stepped down, hand resting gently on Valor's head. A gesture. Familiar. Reassuring. Or maybe a signal. At 9:36, the breach order was given. A blast took down the front door. First through was a tactical officer. No name tag. The second wasn't Elias. 1 second passed. Then another, and then the explosion hit, not inside but from behind the building. Windows shattered. Shockwaves tore through the perimeter. Shards of wall became shrapnel slicing through the air. The entire structure trembled and collapsed like a beast shot in the heart. Valor was the only one who ran toward the blast. No barking, no hesitation, just a straight line, guided by instinct, by the scent of human skin mixed with gunpowder, and something else only Valor could sense. A void. The unnatural silence of someone who should be there, but wasn't. 10 minutes later, the entire team was pulled back due to risk of further collapse. A roll call was taken. 6 wounded, 3 unaccounted for, and one name stopped the entire command center cold. Elias Quinn. Nobody, no signal, no footage, just valor, dragged from the wreckage while still clawing at the debris. Front legs bloodied, dust caked on his face. His right ear was torn. But his eyes hadn't changed, still asking, "Where is my handler?" A week later, an internal report was circulated. Cause of explosion: accidental electrical fault. Elias Quinn. Missing in action. Case closed. And valor? After stitches and a brief neurological review, he was removed from active K-9 duty. The final report read, "Emotional trauma may compromise operational stability." A transfer form was pre-filled. Destination: a retirement kennel in North Texas. On the file, beneath current status, typed in bold Arial 12, "No longer fit for service." Below that, a blank box, a space reserved for the name of a new adopter. No one asked Valor what he wanted. No one questioned why, since being separated from the base, he had refused to eat, refused to sleep, refused to respond to any command. Only one person ever understood him, and that person was gone. From that day on, within federal records, the name Elias Quinn bore a red stamp. Missing. And the name Valor erased. Nowhere to be found. 5 years later, Houston had changed. Not in the way the trees now shaded the streets or how the shopping districts glowed all night long. No, the change lived in the empty spaces. In forgotten lots no one asked about anymore. In old buildings sealed off with faded yellow tape, their original warnings long lost to memory. Places that no longer showed up on city maps, but were still known by name among the veterans, the ones who carried memories no one else dared to touch, and quietly called these ruins home. That's where Elias appeared. As if he had never belonged anywhere else. His hair touched his shoulders now, streaked with silver where black once ruled. His beard grew in uneven clumps. One shoulder slumped lower than the other, like it had long since accepted the weight it carried alone. In the tangled crowd at the Monday morning food station, Elias didn't stand out. But somehow, nobody ever forgot him. They called him Doc. No one knew exactly why. Maybe it was because he once saved an old man who collapsed with seizures in the middle of the street. Or maybe it was how he'd quietly removed a syringe from the trembling hands of a young soldier slipping into addiction, never asking questions, never expecting thanks. Elias never spoke about his past. All he carried was a busted military watch with no minute hand and a small notebook tucked under his coat. Every night, once the upstairs pipes stopped leaking and the city held its breath in the lull between midnight and dawn, he'd sit beneath a flickering bulb and open that notebook. Each page was filled with clumsy lines, faces he remembered, tiny details he refused to forget. A birthmark beneath the left ear, a wedding ring missing its stone, a final sentence spoken before they vanished. These were the witnesses, the ones Elias had sworn to protect. Now he lived for one purpose only, to stay alive long enough to find the truth. No revenge, no reckoning, just a name. His name, etched somewhere in a memory that hadn't yet been erased. Up in North Houston, where fog mixed with factory soot like smoke from a dying cigarette, Elias rented a room in a housing unit for retired veterans. He had no papers, no ID. So he used a different name, Caleb Ford. No one questioned it. People living there weren't the kind to pry. They nodded at each other in the morning, shared painkillers when the nights got cold, and let silence fill the rest. One morning, as Elias passed by a repurposed church now serving as a relief center, a young woman approached and handed him a damp piece of paper. "You should keep this. People with dogs ask about it," she said, then turned and walked off. The ink had smudged from rain, but one line still stood out, printed in bold. Found, German Shepherd wandering near industrial zone, microchipped. Name, Valor, currently held at County Rescue Station. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stood there perfectly still. Then slowly, he folded the paper into quarters, tucked it inside his jacket, right next to the notebook. No one knew he didn't sleep that night. No one saw him dig out an old, creased map of the city, the last one that still marked the location of the county rescue station before the funding cuts erased it from official records. Every red dot on that map had once meant something. A clue, a trace, a thread in a tangled web. But that night, Elias looked at only one thing. One name. Valor. And like a machine, long thought rusted beyond repair, his spine straightened. Not out of hope, not out of belief, but for one simple reason. If Valor was still alive, then nothing was truly over. Across town, on the other side of Houston, where white picket fences still stood straight, and the grass was always trimmed just right, Valor lay stretched across the sun-warmed steps of a red-brick two-story house. It was a bright day. Sunlight slipped through the canopy of red maples, dancing across the dog's thick coat, creating golden streaks like strips of sunlit ribbon melted into fur. Inside, an older man gently wiped dust from a row of medals framed behind glass. His name was Richard Yates, a retired major whose voice was always low and calm, but whose hands trembled every time he bent down to tie his shoes. Beside him stood Emily, his wife. Gentle, soft-spoken, and the kind of woman who often placed her hand on her husband's shoulder not to guide him, but to hold him, in case the world slipped too far away. It was Emily who adopted Valor from the county shelter. When asked why she chose a dog flagged as behaviorally depressed, she answered simply, because those eyes didn't need explaining. Since arriving at his new home, Valor had never once torn anything up, never growled, but also never stayed still for too long. Every night Valor would rise from his bed, make a quiet round through the house slowly, softly, then return to his spot, head resting on his front paws, eyes not quite closed. One evening, as Emily flipped on the evening news, a faint police siren echoed through an old clip in the background, barely audible. Yet Valor stood up instantly, ears erect, body tense like a drawn bowstring. No barking, just a stare, locked onto the screen until the sound faded completely. Afterward, Valor walked out to the porch and sat under the steps until long after midnight. Richard once chalked it up to leftover instincts, until the day he put on his old uniform to take a photo for his 40-year enlistment anniversary. At that moment, Valor turned away. Not leaving the room, not hiding, just not looking. The way Valor stayed quiet, it wasn't the silence of a dog learning how to trust again. It was the silence of something waiting, for a signal that hadn't come yet. The last time Richard took Valor for a walk through the neighborhood, they passed a parked patrol car near the Veterans Memorial. The siren let out a short burst, just a test tone, and Valor froze mid-step. Back arched, jaw clamped shut, tail low, his eyes sharpened into that of a trained enforcer, exactly the way federal canine reports once described dogs operating in hostile zones. In that instant, Richard understood. Inside Valor was a memory never erased. Not because no one had tried, but because it never got closure. When they returned home, he didn't mention it to Emily. He just quietly opened an old drawer and pulled out a brown leather collar. The stitching was worn thin and faintly. You could still make out the hand-carved initials. V-Q. Valor approached and sat down. Richard held out the collar not to put it on, but just to show him. And in that exact moment, Richard was certain of one thing: the light in Valor's eyes, the one that had been gone since the day they met, flickered back to life. Not bright, but enough. Like a signal light pulsing through a fog no one had thought to look into. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was a beginning. That night, in a dream, Valor bolted upright, startled by a sound no one else could hear. No sirens, no voices, only something his mind had stored deep down. A familiar movement, a slight tilt of a head, and a voice one he knew like his own heartbeat. "Hey, buddy." Across the city, in a cramped room on the third floor of a weathered tenement, Elias sat motionless in front of a laptop with half its keys missing. The glow of the screen cast a pale blue light across his face, outlining the fresh creases carved by another sleepless night. On screen, the surveillance footage looped. A hallway, a lobby, a black SUV pulling up to a red line. Inside the vehicle, Sawyer Vance, once the man who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with Elias under enemy fire. The man who once said, "I've got your back." Now? He was a symbol, a sanitized idol of truth and order. Every time Sawyer stepped out of the Homeland Security building, at least 3 reporters waited. Camera flashes followed. Headlines praised him. Federal officer leads fight for truth. Elias didn't look at his face. He focused on one detail: Sawyer's hand holding a small brown leather wallet. He'd seen it before. He'd given it to him. Not for the wallet itself, but for what he'd hidden inside. A micro SD card, tucked beneath the lining during their covert operations in El Paso. That card, if it still existed, held a recording of a phone call between Sawyer and an unnamed official. A conversation outlining the plan to filter internal witness reports. It had been Elias's last ace, but the explosion had stolen his chance to retrieve it. And now, it sat in the hands of the man who could rewrite history. Elias couldn't get close. Every route near Sawyer was under surveillance. Facial recognition systems still had Elias flagged. A single glimpse of his face, even in a side mirror, would trigger a security cascade across federal networks. He'd already tried once. A small cafe near the local news station, where Sawyer always stopped on Thursday mornings. Elias arrived 10 minutes early, took the back corner seat, cap pulled low, fingers wrapped around a cold ceramic cup. Then he saw them. 2 plainclothes agents walking past the glass, earpieces in. Didn't order anything. He left. No hesitation. No trace. He knew. Sawyer knew. They were playing chess, but only one of them owned the board. Back in his apartment, Elias opened the worn notebook. He started a new list: internal data access points. Underneath, he scribbled time slots, supervisor names, behavioral patterns, anything that could crack the system from the outside. This wasn't an investigation anymore. It was survival. And Elias knew one slip, and he'd lose his last advantage. He wouldn't just disappear. He'd be processed, just like the witnesses before him. Every day, he tracked Sawyer from a distance. It felt like watching a reflection of who he used to be, a man carved into perfection. But Elias knew, behind the press conferences, behind the clean suits and polished smiles, there were shadows. Meetings without transcripts, trips with no record, deals sealed in silence. He didn't need to expose it all. He just needed a crack, enough for the light to break through. And Elias believed, no, felt, that somewhere across the city, another pair of eyes was waiting too. Eyes that had learned to wait in the dark. A 4-legged heart. That had never once forgotten the 12th signal. That afternoon, the skies over Houston were neither sunny nor stormy. Clouds drifted quietly above, and the roads below shimmered faintly, recently rinsed clean by the early morning rain. Elias had just left the community food station, cradling a small paper bag with a few canned goods and a loaf of dry barley bread. Under his worn jacket, the brim of a cap shaded his face, and he moved through the crowd like a shadow, unnoticed, unremarkable. At the corner near an elementary school, it was dismissal time. Children's voices filled the air, overlapping with the long screech of a bus brake, then silence, then another screech. A faded yellow school bus rolled to a stop, its front tire kissing the edge of the crosswalk. The doors opened. One by one, the kids began to step off. Elias stood across the street. He wasn't planning to stop. But then, a sharp scream. A boy, maybe 7 years old, had slipped free from his mother's grasp and darted back into the street, chasing something he'd dropped. At that exact moment, a smaller bus approached from the opposite side, its driver blind to the child's path. The bigger bus had blocked the view. Elias didn't think. His body moved before his mind could speak. The paper bag hit the concrete. He shot across the street, foot sliding over wet paint, shoulder brushing the side mirror of the parked bus, and then dropped low, arms scooping the boy in a swift, tight hold. The other bus passed just inches behind them. Tires screeched, people yelled, the mother sobbed, screaming her child's name. Elias didn't hear it all. He only felt the boy clutching his chest, trembling. He gently patted the child's back. 2 light taps, then a pause, a rhythm, a code. Then he knelt, set the boy down safely on the curb, and instinctively tilted his head to the left, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, and spoke in a low, steady voice, meant not for strangers but for someone who'd once known. "Hey, buddy." A bystander caught the whole thing on a phone. The 14-second video hit social media within 30 minutes. The title was simple: "Homeless Man Saves Child from Oncoming Bus." But it was the 9th second, the frame where Elias turned his head and spoke, that stopped people mid-scroll. Because that wasn't how strangers spoke to children. That was how someone once gave orders, in absolute trust, to a warrior trained for the unimaginable. That evening, across town in a quiet neighborhood in the north, Richard was watching the local news replay the clip. Emily was in the kitchen washing dishes, not paying much attention. But beneath the coffee table, sprawled out, half asleep, lay Valor. The moment the video reached the frame with the words, "Hey, buddy," Valor shot upright. No growl, no bark, just stillness. Ears are stiff, eyes locked on the screen, as if the whole world had narrowed into one pixel of memory. Richard saw it, set his glass down, said nothing. Valor stepped closer to the TV, his body tense, his gaze focused, not on the screen but into it, as though he were confirming something that couldn't be smelled or heard, only remembered. Emotion, a tone, a single buried signal. The clip played again. Then a third time. Valor didn't blink. Emily walked in, about to say something, then stopped. Because the look in Valor's eyes wasn't fear, wasn't alertness. It was recognition. In that quiet living room, sunlight spilling over an old sofa, the TV looping the same 14 seconds. Something ancient and buried stirred back to life. Valor moved. Not toward Richard, not toward Emily, just away, down the hallway. He passed the small bedroom where a brown-haired girl sat sketching with a crayon. She looked up as Valor's claws clicked across the floorboards. She opened her mouth to call him, but the door had already tapped lightly against the wall as it swung open. A low, strained rumble came from Valor's chest. Not violent, not angry. It was the sound of something held in for 5 long years, now spilling out in one single breath. A sound not made for ears, but for the air itself, a signal, sent out like an SOS no one had asked for, but someone might still hear. Emily called out. Richard stood. The girl rushed to the doorway, crayon still smudged in her hand. But by then, Valor was already gone. Down the porch, over the fence like a ghost in motion. No pause, no hesitation. Just a single direction. The one from the video. The path wasn't short. Valor had no handler, no GPS, no address. But canines like Valor. They didn't follow maps. They followed the memory. Breath. And the one thing that couldn't be taught, couldn't be stolen. Loyalty. Valor tracked the faint traces left behind by the footage. The dust on the pavement, the tang of steel from the wheels, the scent of Elias soft in the wind, scattered but real. As Valor sprinted past the edge of the park, a man out walking his dog reached out to grab the brown leather collar, but missed. Moments later, an animal control officer was dispatched to the scene. By the time she arrived, there was nothing left but a trail of claw marks etched deep into the dirt. Richard jumped into his car. Emily was already dialing every rescue center in the county. The little girl cried, her unfinished drawing clenched tightly in both hands. "Valor never stays away from me this long," she whispered. But what none of them knew was that Valor hadn't left them. Valor was returning to the only soul he had ever been taught he must never, ever lose. The shadows in Houston grew longer. Street lamps flickered one by one. And beneath that pale golden glow, a gray figure moved along the painted lines of the road. No barking, no hesitation, no glances to the side. That four-legged heart was chasing a signal no one else could hear. No one but him. Valor's gait wasn't smooth. His stride uneven, a limp in his back left leg still lingered from that explosion years ago. But not once did he slow. He tore through cracked sidewalks, crossed unmarked intersections, cut through streets so long forgotten they no longer appeared on the city's digital maps. But Valor was not lost. Every turn, every alley, a memory stirred awake. An abandoned lot where Elias used to train him in hand signals, crouched behind rusted metal drums. A sandwich stand they once took shelter under during a sudden downpour. A three-way junction beneath a highway overpass. The last place Elias had tightened Valor's collar with bloodied hands, whispering something through sirens and the stench of burning nitrate. Valor passed all of it. No pause, no second glance. He wasn't chasing the past. He was reclaiming the present. An hour in, the wind sharpened. Cold crept in from the north. With every breath, white fog puffed from Valor's mouth like steam from a machine long thought broken, but now roaring back to life. A group of teens on bicycles caught sight of him. One started to speak, but none dared get close. There was something in the way Valor moved, a silent authority that made them instinctively step back. That gaze was back, not the gaze of a dog once labeled unfit for duty, but the gaze of a warrior. The same eyes that once scanned smoke and flame, read the flicker of enemy movements, and waited for wordless commands from the only human he had ever answered to. On the wall of an old storage depot, faded red paint still spelled out, "A place untouched." That's where Valor stopped. Not because he was tired, but because of the smell. Blood. Old, but real. It was faint, hidden beneath a layer of dust and the oil-stained scent of truck engines, smeared across the textured concrete wall like a memory someone tried to bury. No one else would have noticed. But Valor did. He lowered his snout, nose grazing earth, eyes half closed as if summoning a ghost from deep within. Then they snapped open icy sharp. He had the trail. And somewhere down this road, Elias wasn't far. This was no longer a chase, no longer an escape. This was a journey home. Just as Valor took his first steps onto that fading scent trail, Another signal lit up, this time from a government server buried beneath Houston's central administrative tower. A facial recognition algorithm had completed a match. 81% certainty that the man in the viral video was Elias Quinn, a missing internal operative. Within 8 minutes, an encrypted alert was sent across silent tactical channels. No public alarms, no routing through official oversight, just a single command: capture alive. Interrogate off record. And at the bottom of that command, the signature of one man, Sawyer Vance. At that moment, in a sterile meeting room on the 16th floor of the Department of Homeland Security, Sawyer stood at the window with both hands clasped behind his back, eyes cast down toward the city like it was a chessboard. And every piece had been moved exactly where he needed it. No one in the room questioned the order. The name Elias Quinn had long been purged from public systems. No one knew he'd once been honored as Community Liaison Agent of the Year. No one knew his disappearance coincided with the vanishing of 3 key whistleblowers from an internal counterintelligence unit. Only Sawyer knew, and Sawyer never forgot. He turned from the glass, lifted a still warm cup of coffee, and spoke with all the gravity of a man reading weather stats. Keep it quiet, no press, no surveillance feeds, containment site. Pick a remote facility. Then he paused, lifted his eyes. And what used to be the eyes of a trusted partner were now so cold it was hard to tell if what stood there was man or mechanism. Interrogate off record. I want this cleaned up. That night, when Elias returned to the old shelter to retrieve a notebook, he felt it before he saw it. Not movement, not shadow. But silence is too perfect to be natural. Before he could reach the door, a floodlight snapped on. Blinding. Unforgiving. Then came a voice, low, familiar from behind. Hands off your body. Kneel. We know who you are. Elsa frozen. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. He recognized that cadence, that sharp edge in the air when power cloaked itself in the absence of noise. Slowly, he lowered his arms, deliberate, controlled, but his eyes, they drifted, as if trying to memorize something. The wind's direction, a trace of smoke in the distance, the rhythm of boots on pavement. Because Elias knew if he didn't make it back, there was one who would never accept the silence. One who had never abandoned his post. Elias didn't resist. When the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he didn't protest, didn't plead, didn't even look at the agents flanking him. His eyes stayed locked forward down a short corridor toward an open door. As he stepped across its threshold, he turned his head once, not to look back, but to check something one last time. A worn section of wall to his left, 6th brick from the bottom, where he'd once hidden a paper scroll. It was gone. Elias exhaled. A soft, weightless release, like letting go of something he'd made sure to pass on before time ran out. All through transport, Elias carried only one possession, a tattered notebook wrapped in faded canvas. No one noticed. No one searched it. Because from the outside it looked like junk random codes, broken lines, sloppy left-handed scrawl, water stains, wrinkled pages. But inside was everything Sawyer couldn't touch. A memory encrypted in trembling strokes, a map in private shorthand, and in the center, one folded page guarding a single golden hair. From Valor. The vehicle veered off civilian routes, steering through industrial zones. No sirens, no escorts. Elias was taken to a decommissioned military bioresearch station on Houston's far eastern fringe. The iron gate swung open without a sound. Figures in black moved in and out, their uniforms bare of any insignia, their presence as ghost-like as the institution they served. Every step echoed off concrete, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made it clear. This place had been built not just to confine bodies, but to bury stories no one was meant to retell. Elias was nudged forward, into a square room. No windows, fluorescent light so white it stabbed the eyes. On the table, a glass of water. The chair, raw steel, its legs scorched, as if someone before had tried to resist and failed. He sat. The notebook stayed on his lap, unopened, unhidden, just held. He didn't look up when the far door hissed open. He didn't have to, because the voice always came after the footsteps, because that stare, the one that strangled the air out of a room, never asked permission before it entered. Sawyer stepped in. White shirt, crisp, gray tie knotted perfectly, a thick envelope of documents in his right hand. But it was his left hand that mattered. A handgun, silencer attached, the kind that never echoes. Elias lifted his head, and for the first time in years, those two pairs of eyes met in the same room again. No shock, no rage, no why. Just silence, the kind that grows teeth. Then Sawyer smiled. But it wasn't a smile you could name. It had no edges, no meaning, just a crack in a mask. At that exact moment, outside the facility, the wind shifted. Rain began to fall hard, sudden, punishing as if the sky itself had been holding its breath and could no longer wait. Valor reached the ridge above the compound. From there, the lights of the outer perimeter painted the walls below in strips of sterile white. No warmth, no soul. Valor didn't bark, didn't move. He just stood there, a statue in the rain. As if something he had waited 5 long years to find was finally within sight, yet still out of reach. The wind carried scents, motor oil, worn leather, old gunpowder, the sour rot of damp walls never touched by daylight, and threading between them, faint, fragile, was another scent. Familiar skin, dried blood from an old explosion, a trace of disinfectant Elias always hated but had to use. Valor stepped forward once, then sat. Ears sharp, eyes locked on the concrete ahead. No one noticed the muddy dog outside the fence. Not in a city where conspiracy wore clean suits and power flowed through wires no one could trace. But if anyone had stood close enough, they would have seen it. In Valor's eyes, there was no fear. Only the order. The one given long ago in another night, another war, when Elias had whispered into his ear, "If I don't come back, you wait." And Valor was waiting. Not like a dog left behind, but like a soldier, assigned his final mission. No breach, no attack, no chaos. Just wait, because of some wars. Aren't won with teeth. They're won with trust. Inside the room, the door shut behind Sawyer with a low, solid sound, the kind of sound metal makes when it strikes the scar tissue of memory. There was no bright light. Just a faint strip spilling down from a vent in the ceiling, cutting across Elias's face like a dull knife that still managed to sting. No recorders, no observers, just the two of them, once brothers in arms, once comrades through fog-drenched winter drills, once the kind of men who pulled each other out of hell without needing to speak. But now one is standing, one sitting, and no longer on the same side. Sawyer stepped forward. His footsteps echoed off the cement like a slow metronome, ticking through the decay of decency. Elias didn't look up. His hand rested on the weathered notebook in his lap, thumb brushing the frayed edge like it was a switch he needed to touch, not to prepare, not to panic, but simply to remember that something still belonged to him. Sawyer stopped, leaned forward, one hand on the table, and spoke. "You know why I'm here?" His voice was gentle, almost soft, like a doctor asking permission before delivering the final injection. Elias looked up. That gaze, the one that once trusted Sawyer, once shared stale cookies on overnight stakeouts, now held only one thing: acceptance, not of death, but of what Sawyer had become. "I know," Elias answered quietly. "You can't stand the idea that someone is still alive." Sawyer chuckled, a smile without shape, without pull at the corners, but his eyes, those changed. They shifted like metal catching the light, eyes of someone who had torn down the wall between idealism and power, between protection and control. "You don't get it, Elias," Sawyer said, taking the seat across from him. "I don't hate you for surviving. I hate you for remembering." Outside, wind slipped through the cracks in the wall, dragging thunder and the tapping of rain across the roof. But inside, the silence was sealed like a heart waiting for its final beat. "You should have let it go," Sawyer said, setting the silenced pistol gently between them. "We both should have." Elias didn't look at the gun. He didn't even look at Sawyer. He asked just one thing soft, almost delicate, but it shattered the quiet like glass under a boot. "Did you ever forget valor?" The room folded in on itself. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, as if the question stirred something electric in the bones of the building. The gun sat still. Its shadow stretched across the edge of Elias's cloth-bound notebook like a dividing line between two memories. One still bleeding, one long rusted shut. Sawyer smirked again, but this time something flickered. A tremor behind the eyes. "Valor," he repeated, swallowing it like gravel. He was just a dog, a piece of equipment. Elias nodded slowly. "Like me?" The wind slammed against the barred window. The steel rattled faintly. Sawyer looked up, then back, and now his gaze didn't drift. It held, a mirror, one side reflecting the pride they once shared, the other revealing a pit Sawyer had fallen into so slowly he never noticed the descent. "You're siding with something that can't protect you," Sawyer muttered, his fingers drifting closer to the grip of the gun. "I sided with survival." Elias was silent. Then, "I sided with the one soul who'd come back for me, if I was betrayed." Sawyer let out a graveled laugh. "And what's the price for that?" Elias didn't answer, because at that moment the rain said everything. The storm outside had thickened. It beat against the building like it was trying to scrub the truth off its walls. Sawyer picked up the gun. Not in haste. Slowly. His finger stroked the barrel as if it were memory itself, remembering the last time he'd held it in the name of justice. He turned it, letting the muzzle settle just above the table. "You're not leaving this room." Elias exhaled. Not in defeat, not in fear. Just a breath from someone who had already seen the bottom. "I know. I don't need to walk out of here. I just need one signal." Sawyer frowned. "What?" Elias met his eyes fully, finally. "If you speak, Valor will know I'm alive." 1 second. Another second passed. In that fragile silence, Sawyer's finger began to squeeze the trigger. And in that exact moment, the door behind him burst open. No slam, no alarms. Just a whisper of wind against cold steel, swinging the door as if it had finally given up trying to hold back what was always meant to arrive. A shadow lunged through. No hesitation, no flicker of doubt. The snarl that followed tore through the room, not like any sound a human being had ever heard. It wasn't the cry of a frightened animal, not a predator's roar. It was the sound of a loyal heart erupting from 5 years of silence. Valor. Soaked in rain and mud, fur tangled and dripping, eyes burning hot like forged iron. The coat that had once been brushed smooth was now matted with street dust and storm water. But none of that mattered. Only the eyes mattered locked on Sawyer's hand. The hand holding the gun pointed at the only person Valor had ever accepted as his. It all happened in the space of a heartbeat, but every witness who later retold the moment remembered it the same way. The first growl came like the sound of steel cracking behind a wall. Valor launched across the room. No arc, no slowdown, a direct line through the years of waiting. And he didn't aim for the weapon. He aimed for the wrist gripping it. Sawyer turned too late. The second sound when teeth sank deep, straight into the tendon. The gun hit the floor. Blood splashed across Elias's notebook, soaking into the fabric cover like ink on memory. Sawyer screamed, not in pain, but terror. The kind of scream a man makes when something pierces his belief that he was untouchable. Valor slammed him to the ground, front paws on his chest, eyes never blinking. He didn't bite again. He just held him there and growled, not like a lion, not like a wolf, not like anything you could find in nature. It was a sound that had waited 5 long years to be heard, full of hurt, full of defiance, full of something ancient and unbreakable. A sound that made the hallway outside tremble. The door swung wide. Security teams flooded in, flashlights and shouts. "Stand down!" someone yelled. But no one fired. No one moved, because something sacred was unfolding before their eyes. A man in cuffs, motionless, lips trembling, a dog torn and trembling from the road standing between him and every threat in the room. Elias lifted a hand, touched the top of Valor's head. Valor didn't turn. But his tail gave one soft wag. No commands, no names, just return. And in that moment in that room, that corridor, that cold and blood-slicked government building, only one truth existed. Loyalty. The kind you can't earn with medals. The kind you can't buy. The kind that survives rain, violence, silence, and time and still comes back when you need it most. Wounded. Soaked. But unshaken. The gunshot cracked through the room that very instant. The first bullet missed it, sliced into the edge of the steel table, sparked off with a flash, then ricocheted near Elias's foot. The second, closer, sharper, punched straight into Valor's shoulder. But Valor didn't stop. Not a cry, not a stumble, not even a flicker in his stride. The force of his leap sent Sawyer crashing backward, his chair tipping as he hit the floor. The gun skidded toward Elias, but he didn't move. He just reached out and shielded Valor's head as blood began to bloom from beneath the thick fur. No one in the room breathed. Valor pinned Sawyer down with the full weight of his body, one paw pressed into his chest, the other clamped the wrist that had held the gun. Valor's eyes were fixed, but not wild, not panicked, not crazed. He was just doing the one thing he was born to do. Protect. Sawyer squirmed. He screamed. But the sound was drowned in Valor's growl, low and steady, echoing off the metal walls like a memory with teeth. That growl didn't roar. It didn't rage. It just reminded the room of something no one dared admit. If you betray the ones who once believed in you, don't expect to escape the eyes that once looked at you with trust. Elias pushed himself upright, wrapping an arm around Valor's neck, steadying him. Blood seeped fast, soaking the fur around his chest, mixing with the rainwater still clinging to his body. "Valor," Elias whispered. But Valor didn't look back. He stayed locked on Sawyer, like if he moved even a breath too soon, the past would find a way to repeat itself. and this time, there'd be no one left to come back for. A crackle buzzed through a radio in the hallway. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. Officers poured into view. Flashlights flared. Hands hovered over holsters, but Elias raised a hand. "Don't!" No one moved, because at that moment, everyone saw something no training ever prepared them for. Protection, not born from orders, but from memory, from every battle fought side by side, from every silent night filled with quiet nods and trust passed in a single touch on a dog's collar. Valor began to tremble. His legs gave out slowly, but he stayed over Sawyer, holding him down with sheer will. Elias leaned forward, wrapping both arms around him, pressing Valor against his chest like letting go would mean losing him to a darkness they couldn't return from. The blood kept coming. From the shoulder, from his side. Maybe a bone shattered. Maybe a vessel hit. But Valor's eyes stayed open. And in a fleeting moment, those eyes turned to Elias. No questions, no pain, just checking, to make sure the other heartbeat was still there. Elias touched his forehead to Valor's. "It's over," he breathed. "You did it. Let me handle the rest." One exhale, no one knew if it came from the dog or the man. But in that small metal room surrounded by blood and betrayal, steel and loyalty, two beings said everything without saying a word. Then Elias lifted his gaze toward the officers frozen at the door. His voice cracked, but it was firm. "We need a medic, right now." One long pause. No one spoke. Some still had guns trained on Elias. Others kept their flashlights on Valor's blood-soaked frame. A few were just trying to process what they were seeing. Then one man stepped forward. The deputy commander of Houston's Special Security Division. His brow furrowed, as if he were looking through the veil of time itself, through the overgrown beard, the tired eyes, the worn jacket. He blinked, and then came the words, "Oh God." "That's Quinn. Elias Quinn. No ID needed, no biometrics." That name, scrubbed from every official database, still lived in memory, in briefing rooms, in classified missions, in whispered tales of integrity. And now, that man, once the moral compass of an entire generation, was sitting on a cold concrete floor, holding a wounded dog, blood running through his fingers like a truth long buried. A command broke through the tension. "Weapons down! Call a medic." Suddenly the room snapped into motion, organized chaos, but not one person stepped too close to Elias. They moved around him, circled wide, as if he and Valor were surrounded by something sacred. Sawyer was still on the floor, one arm pinned, blood seeping from the torn flesh on his forearm. He looked up at Elias, for the first time in years, and there was no pretense in his eyes anymore, no role to perform, no superiority to hide behind. Just silence. Then he turned his head away. A young officer entered. She hesitated, cuffs trembling in her hands, voice uncertain. "Sir, you're being placed under arrest pending investigation." Sawyer didn't resist. He rose quietly, allowed his hands to be bound, and was let out like a ghost who'd lost its weight. Elias didn't watch him go. He only held Valor tighter, as if with every second passing, part of his own warmth was slipping away. The gurney rolled in. A medic knelt down and touched the blood-matted fur. She started to speak, then stopped. Instead, she gently fitted an oxygen mask over Valor's muzzle and clipped a heart monitor to his side. The first beep came through, faint, slow, but steady. Someone whispered, "This dog jumped in front of 2 bullets." Another voice followed, stronger. "Not to attack, to protect." The air thickened, Someone stepped out to make a call to command. No one disturbed Elias. Not one person asked questions. They simply watched from behind doorways, down corridors, from across the threshold, as if something hallowed was unfolding. His hand lay across Valor's neck, stroking gently down the spine, each pass slower than the last, each touch like trying to hold on to a piece of breath drifting into the wind. For the first time in 5 years, people in that building began to ask themselves the real question. Who was the traitor? And who had always been the soldier? No one said a word. The echo of Valor's growl still clung to the walls. The scent of blood, gunpowder, and rain-soaked fur became a memory none of them would be able to shake. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. The medical wing sat at the far end of the old compound. Officers and medics moved back and forth, too busy to pause but always glancing back to the open doorway, where a man sat on the stone step and a dog lay limp in his lap. Elias didn't ask for a private room, didn't request a bed. He just sat there, lowering Valor's head onto his thigh, shielding his body with the thin jacket that had seen too many years. Blood still seeped through the makeshift bandage, but Elias didn't wipe it away anymore. Because he knew this time was better spent staying close. His fingers, once steady with a weapon, once unwavering on signed orders, now trembled as they stroked Valor's spine. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured, not sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. Valor shifted, barely. One ear twitched, just enough to show he was still listening. Elias looked into those eyes clouded with rain, edged in dried blood and fading light. Then, with a voice almost gone and a breath tangled in the wind, he said, "Good boy." His hand tightened, softly, so softly not to hurt. "You found me." A gray beam of light slipped through the overhang. The rain still fell, but it had gentled now like the sky itself was grieving too. And in that wet haze, Valor, too weak to open his eyes, wagged his tail. Once. Not hard. But enough. Elias closed his eyes, one hand still around Valor's neck, the other pressed to his own chest, a signal no one ever taught him, but one he'd carried inside him for years. There was no applause. No one approached. But in the way every eye held the scene from afar, one truth was undeniable. That man was not alone. And that dog was not just a dog. He was a witness, a brother in arms. The last symbol of loyalty the world had forgotten is loyalty that doesn't live in files or medals, but in every scar, every step, every look, and sometimes in the final breath, whispered in the middle of a rainy afternoon that no one needs to hear to feel like the earth itself has been shaken. The next morning, the rain had stopped. But the grounds of the Rehabilitation Center for Former Intelligence Officers still shimmered with dampness, as if the night's silence had soaked into the soil and hadn't quite let go. Elias sat by the window. A white hospital blanket hung loosely around his shoulders. Beside him, a small table with nothing on it but a glass of cold water and a single notebook. Covered in faded khaki fabric, its edges frayed and corners worn from years of holding on. It was the only thing Elias had asked to bring when he left the detention facility released, under conditional supervision, with mandatory psychological monitoring. Not because his body was wounded, but because someone had decided that a man who had survived 5 years underground, after an explosion allegedly erased his memory and sanity, should be watched more than listened to. Elias didn't argue. He simply sat there, fingertips tracing the stitched edge of the notebook's cover, the same way he used to run his hand along Valor's spine every night, slow, steady, never rushed. The curtain fluttered softly. Sunlight spilled across his hand as Elias opened the first page. No title, no preface, just a list. Written by hand, names, dates, and 2 small marks beside each entry. A circle meant someone had gone missing. A slash meant confirmed dead. Elias turned page after page. And every time he paused, he read the name softly, like summoning an old friend. Someone who used to laugh in the hallway, walk past biometric scanners, sit across the table during morning briefings, or once held a leash attached to a dog like Valor, before disappearing without a trace. There were no graves for them, no funerals, only whispers buried inside the system. Reassigned, early retirement, went AWOL. But Elias knew. No one left willingly. They had been erased. And now, those names everyone lived again in ink soaked with sweat, rain, and blood. His hand stopped near the back of the notebook. One name had been crossed out repeatedly, like the writer had tried to forget, but couldn't. It was the name of a woman, an agent, the last person who had believed him, who had tried to send a classified report just before everything collapsed. Elias lifted his gaze. Out the window, a few other patients were practicing their steps on the back lawn. A little farther off was a small garden. And under the shade of a maple tree, a figure lay still. Valor still there. He couldn't stand yet, but his eyes were open. Not alert, not in pain, just calm, as if to say, "Go on." Elias looked back down at the page, a blank one. He pulled a pen from the pocket of his patient robe. The ink still flowed. His hand still trembled slightly, but the script somehow held its shape. The first line he wrote, "Those who haven't been named." And then he began to write. Not like a report, not like a condemnation, but like a vow witnessed by the steady eyes of a German shepherd lying in the sunlight, one ear twitching and a heart still beating. Valor was moved to a specialized recovery wing, a small room beside a garden, tiled in soft ivory, with a window that opened eastward where morning light spilled in like an unspoken greeting. He couldn't stand yet. The wound across his chest was still wrapped. One of his front legs was stabilized in a soft brace. But his eyes were still the same. Not shattered. Just the gaze of a being that had learned how to face pain without barking, without panic, without running. Every morning, Elias came and sat by the window, reading aloud from his notes. He didn't need anyone to hear, didn't expect anyone to respond. But once, when he spoke the name of someone they'd served with during the Iron Bridge operation in 2021, Valor stirred. His ears twitched. And Elias knew Valor still remembered. That whole morning, Elias didn't write anything new. He just sat there, his hand resting gently on Valor's head, thumb stroking the bridge of his nose. With every touch, memories flickered to life, not in order, not with logic, but vividly. A red clay training field, the whistle of command drills, boots striking dirt in sync. Elias Younger, buzz cut, uniform still crisp, stood tall, signing with his hands, a specific gesture used only when voice contact was compromised. The only one who understood that signal was Valor. There was a moment during a simulated mission when Elias slipped from a metal rooftop. No one reacted fast enough. But within seconds, Valor had leapt from the top of a shipping container and shielded his handler's body, growling at the others until Elias pushed himself up and gave the all clear. It was irrational, but no one blamed him, because only Elias gave Valor orders, and only Valor understood that collapsing didn't mean defeat. Sometimes it was a signal not for retreat, but for something else, something quieter, something deeper. Every gesture was a story. A blink, a long whistle, a soft tap on the belt buckle. They had once communicated that way through minefields, hostage rescues, and covert investigations where no tech was allowed. And now, in this quiet room, only the memories kept humming like a device that never needed recharging. Valor blinked slowly. Elias looked down and smiled faintly. Valor didn't need to run anymore. The mission now wasn't protection. It was to endure, to bear witness. And Elias knew if there came a day Valor couldn't go on, then it would be his turn to carry the story forward. Not far away, inside a federal inspection office in downtown Houston, blue light from a data screen flickered across the face of a young officer, Celia Maris. 27, ponytail tight, eyes sharp. She had studied criminal forensics but chose internal operations not for ambition, but because she once had a dog like Valor. His name was Kuno. He had died during a raid on a human trafficking ring. When the video surfaced, dog attacks high-ranking officer to protect declared missing man, Celia requested access to the explosion case file. She was denied. Then granted a heavily redacted, preliminary summary. But while reviewing the archived audio logs, she caught something, a tiny timing discrepancy. A voice flagged as Sawyer Vance issued an early evacuation order just before the blast, but that order didn't appear in the official record. And in Elias's file, there was a deleted note wiped clean with a timed malware that had once read, "Internal evidence secured, preparing to transfer." The rest couldn't be recovered. For Celia, even that was enough. Not to doubt Elias, but to question an entire system that once declared, "We leave no one behind." Celia wasn't the kind to slam fists on boardroom tables. She just quietly opened another file, cross-checked mission logs, found the name Valor referenced 29 times, each marked, "Does not meet threshold for commendation." Celia's hands paused. She looked out the window. A sparrow had landed on the sill, bowed its head, then flew away. Celia reached for her phone and typed a message. "I need to meet Elias Quinn." Not to interrogate, but to listen. And listening, real, patient, deliberate listening, was one of the few things still sacred in those sterile white boardrooms where internal committees gathered behind closed doors. 3 days later, an internal investigation was quietly launched under mounting public pressure. Hundreds of thousands had shared the clip. Valor bursting into the interrogation room, bleeding from the shoulder, pinning Sawyer Vance beneath his chest. The frame was grainy. Elias's face never appeared, but Valor's eyes that look at it silenced assumptions. For the first time in nearly a decade, the name Elias Quinn surfaced in the system again, not as a deserter, but as a question still unanswered. The hearing room was buried in the basement of the federal compound. 4 soundproof walls, 3 cameras, 2 transcription officers, and 1 steel door locked from the outside. No microphones, no live stream. But everything was recorded, not for release, but to know. Valor wasn't allowed inside. He lay just beyond the doorway, head resting on his own leg, eyes half shut. But everyone understood if something went wrong in that room, he would break through that door. No command needed. Elias wore no uniform, no restraints. Yet there was something in his calm gaze that made the officials across from him seem smaller, not because of his rank, but because of trust, the kind that clings to a man like an old scar. Celia Maris was granted authority to lead the inquiry, and no one objected. Because she'd asked the only question that mattered. Why was a declared missing man hunted like a criminal instead of protected like a surviving witness? Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The first to be questioned was the commanding officer of the AP the night of the explosion. He claimed no memory of a pre-scheduled withdrawal, until Celia played the audio file. Crystal clear. Next came the data tech who had deleted Elias's final report. He fumbled, then fell silent, denied everything, but could explain nothing. The hearing lasted over 6 hours. No one left as they had entered. Because for the first time in a decade, someone questioned loyalty not to rank, but to truth. And the only one who said nothing was Valor. But when Elias stepped out and gave him the faintest nod, that silent dog's eyes said more than any defense ever could. Trust. Celia waited until the second day of testimony to reveal the evidence, not because it wasn't ready, but because she knew something deeper. Too early, and it feels emotional. At the right time, it feels unavoidable. She placed a small USB drive on the table. It looked like nothing. But when plugged in, the atmosphere shifted instantly. A quiet hush, that particular kind of silence when people realize their excuses are about to expire. The screen lit up blue, a voice recording. Less than 20 seconds long. Pulled from encrypted internal comms, accessed by only 2 people at the time, Sawyer Vance and Elias Quinn. Eastgate will lock after the last unit exits. All teams evacuate before tea time. Leave no one behind. Sawyer's voice. Even filtered through software, his tone was unmistakable, especially the way he always used "leave no one behind," not as a vow, but as a cleansing order. No rescuing, no survivors. Elias said nothing. Neither did Valor. Celia moved on. Next, she placed a notebook on the table, the original log Elias had been writing for weeks. Every name, every time, every location. Details down to the scent of gunpowder, the odd license plate outside a burned site, all meticulously documented. An aging officer tried to dismiss it, until Celia cued a clip from an old security cam 13 seconds long. It showed Sawyer exiting the control center, a hallway map in hand, during the same window when a false fire alarm had been triggered. There was no sound. But his expression as he glanced backward toward where Elias and Valor were last seen revealed something colder than guilt. It looked like peace. That particular peace people wear when they believe the erasure is complete. In the hearing room, no one spoke. No one asked how Celia found the footage. They all know. Sometimes, to uncover the truth, you don't need cutting-edge tools. You just need patience. And a reason not to quit. Celia found hers the day she first saw the video of that bloodied old dog, flinging himself through a door to shield someone the system had tried to erase. That reason was waiting outside the hearing room now under the early light, ears alert, eyes open, a witness that didn't need to testify, only to exist. That day's session ended with no gavels, no verdicts, just silent footage, playing out frame by frame. Then came the final evidence, a partially recovered hard drive retrieved from the old evidence locker sealed after the explosion was brought in a transparent container. Tech had only restored fragments, but fragments were enough. The screen lit again. An empty hallway, fluorescent lights flickering. No voices, no footsteps, just a skewed security cam capturing dust in the air. Then Sawyer, all black uniform, calm stride, scanning corners like a man inspecting security. But he wasn't holding a passkey panel. He held a physical key, one of only 3 in existence. He paused before a steel door. The sign above it read, Data Vault Restoration Wing. This was the room Elias and Valor had been dispatched to on orders to extract the broken chain of command logs. Sawyer didn't look up, didn't hesitate. He inserted the key, turned, and walked away. The door closed softly. No mechanical click, no metal hiss, just the hush of a final seal. Above the frame, the indicator light shifted from green to red. the system had entered lockdown mode. That meant anyone inside wasn't getting out, no communication, no retreat. Then, in the grainy frame, a flicker, a sudden flare of white, an explosion. The feed cut out just seconds later, but not before it captured one final detail. Sawyer, still in the same spot. No panic, no flinch. Just watching the smoke rise, as if confirming the job was done. Inside the hearing room, silence took over. One man lowered his head. A woman clenched her fists not out of anger, but because she suddenly felt the weight of years spent in silence. Elias didn't look at them. Didn't need to. His eyes remained fixed on the window on the patch of grass beyond it, where Valor lay still. Celia understood in that moment. There were no more questions. There didn't need to be. The answers had been there from the beginning in the way Valor refused to settle in any new home, in the quiet growls at the sound of sirens, in those unblinking eyes, sharp, aware, and unwilling to forget. Just once, during the entire inquiry, Elias bowed his head and whispered, not to the room, but to himself. He couldn't forget, because I haven't been able to. Outside, the wind curled softly past Valor's ears. He didn't stir, but his chest rose and fell, as if he understood. That the war from 5 years ago, the one no one had listened to, no one had believed in, had finally been heard. And this time, the gate was no longer locked. 1 week after the hearing, a formal statement from the Federal Oversight Committee was sent to all internal agencies. Elias Quinn fully exonerated, all honors, medals, and entitlements reinstated. The news spread fast, as these things often do, but Elias no longer cared about speed or headlines. He sat on the old wooden bench behind the recovery center, right where he and Valor greeted the morning sun each day. In his hand, a cup of coffee gone cold. His eyes weren't on the paper Celia held out. They were tracing the lazy swirl of leaves dancing in the wind. Celia stepped closer, a soft smile on her lips. She held out the document. "You can return," she said gently, "if you want." Elias took it, read the first few lines, then folded it closed and set it down beside the bench. "I know," he replied softly. "But you won't?" she asked. Elias shook his head slowly. "It's not out of anger or mistrust." He glanced down, resting his hand on Valor's head, the dog still lying beside him, eyes half closed, tail flicking just once as if in agreement. "It's just that I already found the one thing I need to protect." Celia looked at them, a man once erased from the record books, and a dog once cast aside like broken gear. She realized then, some people don't come back to pick up where they left off. They return to preserve what's still right in this world. In the new archives, Elias Quinn's file now read, "Status fully active." But in truth, Elias stayed in one place, the West Houston Veterans Recovery Center. He spent his days listening to broken stories from others who had once walked where he'd walked. Every week, he added a few more lines to the fabric-bound notebook, now twice as thick as it had been. And each morning, when Elias stepped out onto the porch and called, Valor rose to his feet slower now, a little shaky, but my eyes are still bright. There was no need to return to the field, because the real battle was here, staying kind in a world that once tried to forget you. The front yard had no fences, just open grass, old maple trees, and a view stretching toward a quiet street. Kids from the nearby low-income blocks often ran across the field at midday, with plastic soccer balls and dreams too young to name. At first they kept their distance. The big gray dog resting under the porch made them uneasy. One boy even whispered to Elias, Does he bite? Elias chuckled, crouching beside Valor. He placed a hand gently on the dog's head. If you're a good kid, he said, he'll know. A few days later, a little girl named Marcy, curly-haired and brave, was the first to step forward. She didn't touch Valor. She just sat beside him, placed her hand on the wooden floorboards, and whispered, "I'm a good person." Valor didn't move. But his tail tapped once against the porch. And just like that, he earned a new title. The old guy who protects good people. No one voted for it. It just stuck. Each afternoon, while the kids played and laughed in the grass, a gray shadow sat still at the edge of the porch, ears alert, eyes following every movement, never barking, never interfering. But the moment someone cried, or a hand pushed another too hard, Valor stepped forward. No growl, no snap. Just the presence of a warrior who had once walked through war. And that alone was enough to make the kids fix themselves. Some parents began to stop by. They asked about the dog. Some were surprised to hear Valor was once a high-level canine. Others teared up when they watched the old viral clip again. So, he's the one who saved that man? Elias didn't answer. He just looked out at the yard. He didn't save anyone, Elias finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He just didn't let something awful happen, not if he could stop it. And from that moment on, Valor became something more than a dog. He became a quiet emblem of loyalty that needed no words, of goodness that didn't need to be taught, and of the quiet strength it takes, simply to stay. One afternoon, little Marcy gave Elias a drawing she made with her colored pencils. It was rough and innocent, the kind only a child could create. In the picture, an old man with silver hair sat reading a book. Next to him, a large dog rested its head on the man's leg. Elias didn't say anything. He just smiled, ruffled her curls, and taped the drawing to the wooden door of his room. In the corner of the page, written in bubble letters, Marcy had scribbled, "I believe in that old man." The next morning, Elias put on an old gray shirt, carefully buttoning it up. In his hand, a small ribbon, dark blue, its edges slightly frayed. There were no medals, no dress uniform, because the only thing worth bringing that day was already waiting on the porch, basking in the morning sun. Valor had been up before anyone called. No bark, no sound, just a gentle step forward, his nose nudging Elias's knee. Then he lifted his head, patiently waiting for the signal. They walked together, side by side, to the town square, where the memorial for fallen K9s stood. No velvet rope, no fancy carpet, just a black stone slab carved with names, and beneath it, the inscription, "For those who never needed words to understand the human heart." As Elias and Valor arrived, the crowd instinctively parted, leaving a narrow path that led straight to the memorial. No one clapped, no one spoke, only a few quiet breaths, a few hands covering mouths, and the soft sound of tears slipping down the cheeks of those who had once worn uniforms and fought beside warriors with 4 legs and silent souls. Elias stood still. Valor sat beside him, shoulder tilted from an old wound, but his head held high. Ears alert, eyes steady. A breeze passed through, and the ribbon in Elias's hand lifted gently in the wind. He stepped forward, tying it onto a small iron hook on the stone, the spot where people usually hung wreaths. No speeches, no formal ceremony, only a few children standing at the edge, children who once felt Valor's quiet protection, stepping forward in silence. They placed wild daisies, freshly picked from roadside grass, right by Valor's paws. Elias didn't stop them. He just smiled and whispered softly, so quietly it was barely sound, "Thank you." As the crowd began to drift away, Elias and Valor remained gazing up at the names etched into stone. The sun cast long, golden shadows across the ground. One of those shadows belonged to a dog stretched wide and still across the bricks. But it wasn't just the outline of a retired canine. It was the shape of a witness, a soul that had lived through war, through betrayal, and still chose to stay. To guard what was right. There was no applause. No host stepped forward with a microphone. No banners, no reporters pushing in for a headline. Only a single wooden table, placed in the center of an open square. On it, a modest photo frame, unglassed, weather-worn. Inside the frame, a faded picture. A younger Elias, seated on grass, elbows resting on his knees, his face still unmarked by scars. Beside him, Valor was still just a rookie, coat dark, eyes blazing, ears pricked like he was awaiting a command. No one knew exactly when the photo had been taken. No one asked, because everyone understood. The most important things are never in the documents. A little girl stepped forward, about 8 years old, hair the color of fire, tied back with a frayed white ribbon. She held a sprig of lavender and placed it gently before the frame. And as she turned to leave, she glanced back, whispering something only one soul heard. Valor. He tilted his head ever so slightly, then sat down quietly. No bark, no movement, just stillness staring into the version of himself in the photograph, as if facing a time when bravery had never been questioned. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to cry. Software. Barely a whimper. Then silence, again, as though even tears feared to interrupt what was unfolding. An older woman stepped up to Elias and placed her hand over his. She didn't say a word. Didn't need to. And that was enough. There was no list of achievements read aloud. But every glance, every gesture, every small flower left by trembling hands became a silent salute to those who never asked for glory. Valor would never be a chapter in textbooks. But what he left behind lived in the memory of every life he had touched, every witness who once believed the world had run out of kindness. The plaque appeared the next morning. No ceremony, no camera crews, just a few volunteers arriving earlier than usual, carrying an old brass plate, polished by hand, the etching done with care. No glossy finish like a Hall of Fame, no gold trim like a medal. But the words needed no embellishment. Valor, a symbol of loyalty beyond the rules. They bolted it beneath the stone with 4 small nails. No one cut a ribbon. No speeches were made. Only silence, long, fragile, beautiful. A silence so whole that nobody dared to break it. Marcy came forward again, pigtails bouncing, arms wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. She walked right up to Valor without fear or hesitation, sat beside him, and placed a round pebble before his nose. "For you to keep," she whispered, "in case something bad tries to come again." Valor didn't move, but his ears remained high. And Elias, standing a few paces behind, remembered a morning long ago, in a place with no name, when a pebble had been handed to him in the same quiet way. Back then, the giver had been Valor. The sun climbed higher, casting long streaks across the white stone square. Someone raised their phone to take a picture, then slowly lowered it again. Because some moments aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be kept. A small bench sat nearby, empty, left perhaps for the witnesses who no longer walked among them, for the unnamed dogs, the unlisted souls, who once stood between danger and the innocent, and now stood in memory only. And under that bronze plaque, in the shadow of that quiet square, sat a gray-coated sentinel saying nothing. not leaving, just being, as if to remind the world that loyalty never needed permission to exist. A breeze rolled gently through the plaza, rustling the grass, causing the trees to bow. No one said a word. No one took a step. They all just watched. Elias leaned slightly forward, reaching down for Valor's leash. He didn't tug, didn't command, just gave the slightest familiar squeeze signal 12, the one they used in over 100 life-or-death operations. Valor stood up, not quickly, but without hesitation. His coat is now grayer, his gait slower, but his eyes still clear. The eyes that had once led Elias through fire. The eyes that never wavered when Elias disappeared. The eyes that now, once again, looked up as if to ask, "Where to now?" Elias didn't answer. Elias simply smiled, a smile that hadn't visited his face in a long, long time. And so the two of them, a soldier without insignia and a dog without a mission, turned away from the memorial together. Their footsteps fell into rhythm with the fading light, casting a single steady shadow across the white stone floor. No drums, no anthem, only the whisper of the wind, and the slow, even cadence of steps, like breathing. Ahead of them, the sun was setting. But the path was still lit. There was nothing left to say. Because some battles don't begin with bullets. Some begin the moment a four-legged soul refuses to abandon the one they love. And some victories don't come from courtrooms or medals, but from a quiet nod, a steady stride, and a dog who once walked through fire, betrayal, and oblivion, and still chose to stay. The story of Elias and Valor isn't just about uncovering the truth. It's about a bond that transcended time, crossed distance, and defied every rule written by man. A man who had been erased, a dog who had been dismissed, and yet both chose to remain, not for a cause, but for a promise. A German Shepherd isn't just a smart breed. They are loyalty made flesh, courage made quiet, love made unconditional. And if anyone still questions whether goodness truly exists in this world, just look into Valor's eyes, and you'll understand kindness is never erased.